Hello, and welcome. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Hi, my name is Aaron Hadley, and I am the director at the Jewish Federation of Southern Illinois and of Camp Ben Frankel. Tonight is the third event in our virtual event series that we launched a couple months ago. And tonight, our event here is a partnership of 9 small Jewish federations from across the country. From California, the Jewish Federation of Ventura County, to Kansas, the Mid-Kansas Jewish Federation, to Kentucky, the Jewish Federation of the Bluegrass, New Jersey, the Jewish Federation and Jewish Community Foundation of Atlantic and Cape May counties, 2 federations in New York, the Jewish Federation of Greater Orange County and the Jewish Federation and Foundation of Rockland County, straddling Iowa and Illinois, the Jewish Federation of Quad Cities, and then also in Illinois, the Jewish Federation of Champaign-Urbana, and our Jewish Federation of Southern Illinois, Southeast Missouri, and Western Kentucky. We're here also because we are a summer camp. Our Jewish Federation runs a summer camp. Camp Ben Frankel was founded about 75 years ago, almost 74. If you're keeping track. Originally, our camp, Camp Ben Frankel, was founded for children from small Jewish communities in Southern Illinois. And here we are, all these years later, inspired by those ideas about providing a Jewish community for kids who need it. But our scope has evolved, and our vision for Camp Ben Frankel is that there's a place for any Jewish child to belong. A place that's welcoming and accepting and inclusive for kids from any Jewish background. This might mean kids like originally intended for kids from small Jewish communities, and it might also mean kids from any other community, whether those, in particular, there are some communities that we really focus on trying to be intentionally inclusive and welcoming for, like Jews of color, children with disabilities or special needs, children from immigrant families or non-native English speaking families, also from interfaith families. And then of course, from LGBTQ plus camper staff and families. In fact, last week, Camp Ben Frankel completed a multi-year project with Keshet, the Shivyon Equality Project for Jewish summer camps. And Camp Ben Frankel was named an LGBTQ safe zone. We're proud that Camp Ben Frankel was also rated the number one in parent and family satisfaction, according to surveys from more than 100 Jewish camps in North America last year. We are here tonight for a panel discussion focusing on how to support LGBTQ plus Jewish youth wherever they are. And we are humbled and grateful to be joined by an incredible panel whom you'll meet shortly. But it's my privilege to introduce our moderator tonight, Selena Simmons Duffin. Selena is a health policy correspondent for NPR. And Selena, welcome. We're so excited to have you, and thank you. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Selena, and we'll minimize my window here. Thanks so much.
Yes, hi. Hi, everybody. It's a little later for me. I'm on the East Coast, but thanks for taking the time out of your evening to be with us. I am going to read some biographies of our panelists and give them a chance to just say hello, and I'll ask them a quick question so that we can kind of start the conversation and you can get a sense for who they are. So I'll start with Shira. Shira Berkowitz is a panelist from Camp Indigo Point. Shira has 15 years plus of years of experience with camp, leading programmatic areas, supervising campers and curriculum, song leading and loving camp. Shira has been a camp leader at Camp Sabra, Herzl Camp, and Camp Ben Frankel, as well as Remote Amuna Day Camp. Aside from camp, Shira creatively merges their strengths as a social entrepreneur, designer, and policy and communication strategist to lead Promo's Policy Strategy, an organization striving to achieve comprehensive equity for LGBTQ plus Missourians. They hold an MFA from Washington University of St. Louis and is dedicated to building spaces for people to grow as community while addressing civic and social challenges in our built environment. They are a founding board member of Matovu, a Jewish neighborhood center in the city, and serves as the board of directors for the Jewish Federation of St. Louis, and are a founding member of Marsh, a queer bioculture laboratory and mutual aid hub. So hi, Shira, thank you for being here and being a panelist. I'll just ask you to start off if there's anything about this particular historical moment for queer people and especially queer youth that stands out to you on the eve of Pride this year.
Yeah, thank you for being here and reading my whole bio. That was great. I think that for me, most particular, where we have advanced to as a society has made a real, significant, comfortable environment for trans and gender expansive and queer kids to be themselves and live outwardly as who they are. And because of the political climate, which kind of negates some of that sense of belonging and sense of deeply understanding their own authenticities, that it is our prerogative to build as many spaces that outwardly welcome and foundationally include youth as possible, in spaces for them, by them, and in all of the wider community, and to be visible and vocal and outward about how any organization or summer camp has space for queer and gender expansive kids, as well as has the facilities and the infrastructure to embrace them and to allow their identities to be a secondary characteristic of how they integrate in societies and in our camps, and not something that they have to hold and be overly mindful of and anxious about. That's my 2 cents.
I said great, but I was muted. Thank you so much. So next, I'll introduce Rabbi Micah Buck-Yael from Keshet. So Rabbi Micah is Keshet's Director of Education and Training, where he supports organizations across the spectrum of Jewish life to build communities in which LGBTQ+ Jews and our families can thrive. Before Keshet, Micah had the position of Coordinator of Community Chaplaincy with the Jewish Family and Children's Service of St. Louis, where they provided personalized support, connection, and meaningful programming for individuals throughout the St. Louis community. And he has a BA in Jewish, Islamic, and Near Eastern Studies from Washington University in St. Louis, and an MA in Talmud and Rabbinic Literature and Rabbinic Ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and has spent a lot of time advocating and educating for LGBTQ+ belongings, leading trainings and consultations. And he lives in St. Louis with his wife, Aviva, 4 children, and assorted pets. So to kick things off, why don't I put the same question to you about this particular moment and what kind of stands out to you? What do you think about it in the context of history?
I think that's a fabulous question. I think sitting in this moment, I can't help but remember that Pride is and has always been about making change and moving forward a world of dignity and of safety for LGBTQ+ people. And I feel like we're living in a world right now where there is both so much more access to information, to language, to describe ourselves, to connection with people who might hold similar identities. And at the same time, along with that has come, as Shira shared, so much more public commentary or debate. I'm sort of putting debate in quotes because it assumes sort of a question that has 2 potential answers that one sorts through.
Both sides is
concept,
right.
dignity, which is really my starting point. So I want to say that in some ways this year approaching Pride as a time of celebration can feel hard because it doesn't feel like a time of celebration, especially here in Missouri. And that actually feels very fitting to me. That's what the work and that's what the celebration of Pride has so much been about. How and why do we keep joy at the center of the work that we do for change? Right? Because we can't let it take that toll on us, that the work for our basic dignity also gets to rob us of our joy. It does not. So we're going to keep the work moving, but we're going to keep it moving while holding on to celebration.
Well said. Makes me want to go to a parade. Okay, so last I'll introduce Rose Kantorczyk. Ooh, I should have asked you how to pronounce this before we started.
Kantorczyk.
Kantorczyk. Okay, apologies. Rose Kantorczyk, who joined SOJOURN as their communications associate in 2021, spreading the word about SOJOURN's programs, partnerships, and advocacy opportunities through their newsletter, website, and social media. They cut their teeth in Jewish advocacy and storytelling as a fellow at Rice University's Religion and Public Life program and landed at SOJOURN following a stint in digital fundraising for politics. And Rose holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and policy studies from Rice University and currently resides in Houston. Hello, good evening, Rose.
Hello.
I'm gonna throw a slightly different question to you because you did a interview earlier this week for the St. Louis Jewish Light outlet, and mentioned your love of fun facts and the intersection of Judaism and queerness. And so I would like to ask you to share some of your favorite fun facts.
I think that something that people don't know is don't acknowledge so much is that there's a lot of gender expansiveness in the Torah and in the Talmud. One of my, it's a little bit more in the Talmud than in the Torah, or people in the Talmud talking about how they can interpret the Torah gender expansively. But one of my favorite little mishmash fun fact Torah headcanons, I guess, is about the gender diversity of Isaac and Rebecca, where Isaac, there's a semi-controversial midrash that during the binding of Isaac, Isaac before that had a female soul, and then during the binding of Isaac, his female soul was replaced with a male soul. And then also when Rebecca is first introduced in the Torah, a pronoun is used for her that's typically used for a young man in biblical Hebrew. That could have been because she was out there doing all kinds of like independent things. She was out alone getting water for the camels, which was a pretty typically masculine thing to be doing at the time. So I like in my brain sort of add those together and think that Isaac and Rebecca had some queerness, some gender expansiveness going on.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Thanks for sharing that, and I'll pick your brain for more of those at a later date. I'd like to return now, I think, to something that Shira said in that first question and answer we just did. And you mentioned something about keeping identity and having your identity be something that you don't have to make primary in some way, like it can just kind of exist and you don't need to like wave it around or like make it all about who you are. And one of the interesting things I think about this conversation is it's really about the intersection of two identities. You have Jewish identity, you have queer identity. In some ways, both of those identities can be quite marginalized. And so being at that intersection, I think, is kind of an interesting thing. So I was wondering, as somebody who works a lot with young people, like if you could expand a little bit more on that idea of your identity not having to be a thing that you focus on and that everybody kind of has to focus on about you.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a little bit more nuance than I originally like let on hearing you like repeat it. And I want to clarify that like I think we should have ample opportunity to celebrate and be proud of our identities, whether that's Jewish identity or queer identity. And for a lot of transgender individuals right now, because of the legality of moving around in spaces, it's a lot heavier to have to like constantly think about like, am I safe in this bathroom? Am I safe in this cabin? Do people see through who I really am? Are they like thinking about what is in my pants type of thing? And that's a lot of what Micah was saying, or Rabbi Micah was saying, because of the political climate and the rhetoric that we are inundated with. So when I mean like to have an opportunity to put it down, it's to accommodate it in such a way, to accommodate being transgender or being queer in such a way that we don't have to question if we're comfortable in a space or not, or if we belong in a space. So that is to say, like, all gender restrooms makes a transgender person never have to question if they're going to be harmed in a space or be pushed out. Having like really clear clothing expectations while swimming, and saying that like any swimwear that is appropriate for anyone's gender is welcome here, makes it so that I feel comfortable being in this pool with cisgender people and gender expansive people. So like having the infrastructure where there isn't the burden of anxiety or worry allows us to be proud of who we are and also like find and access that joy, which I think is what everybody has also brought up as like the most important thing. Is in order to be playful and feel very welcome and feel like we can celebrate who we are, first we have to remove the barriers of the heaviness that a lot of queer and trans people carry because of the political climate right now.
And maybe let something else about yourself come out, you know, if you can set that down, like, I love to swim. I love to swim. And maybe that doesn't have to be politicized in any way. I do love to swim, but that was just an example speaking to the swimwear comment you made, which I think is a really good point. To Rabbi Micah, you mentioned the politics in Missouri and what's been happening in that particular state. I'm guessing most of the people who are in attendance tonight have been following in some way or care about this issue in some way, but just in case someone needs a recap, can you give a sense for what's been happening in this legislative session that you were alluding to and your opening statements there?
Absolutely. And the first thing that I want to say is that I think there's a really core difference between someone's identity and existence being political versus people's identity and existence being politicized, right? That when I talk about what does it mean to say, I want to be able to wake up in the morning, go to work, go to the grocery store, bring home groceries, pick something up at the pharmacy, those are not inherently political actions, but those are actions that become politicized when there are those who would sort of seek to use the existence of trans people as a source of fear. So there's been a lot of conversation in Missouri about the ability of trans people to access gender affirming medical care, about the ability of schools to teach materials that represent the baseline existence of trans and gender expansive and LGBTQ plus people in general. And there were a number of rather challenging moments that have come about during this legislative session. And I actually want to pass this back to Shira as the legislative expert on this panel to really talk us through the ins and outs of that.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. Yeah, I can say for like, are we all Missouri specific or, right? That makes this
not, but we can use, I mean, a lot of these, there's a lot of duplication across states. So since that is your focus, I think just talking through what's been happening in Missouri is helpful for people understanding what's happening kind of even beyond Missouri.
Definitely. As Micah alluded, Rabbi Micah alluded, we have like the number one priority of the conservative movement generally in our country. Their priority is to take away the rights of transgender individuals. That has been narrowed down since we had bathroom bill restrictions to access for gender-related care to youth, to access to playing sports. And there is like a foundational goal of all of this, but it has politicized the identity of being trans. 14 states have now are close to or have passed laws that restrict the access for transgender youth and sometimes adults from being able to access the healthcare that they need and invalidate that healthcare, or restrict the access that they have to playing sports according to their own identity. And both of those things have created an environment where parents are very fearful for how their children move in the world, for their safety as parents. Trans adults have a lot of questions about their own safety and where they feel like they can live and thrive and access all of the resources that they need as humans to live. And like very specifically in Missouri, we have also restricted gender affirming healthcare. And we are probably going to be the only state that does not ban access for referring patients out of state. There's no criminalization or penalization for doing that. So we might have a lot of youth who live in Missouri and seek care in Illinois or in Kansas, or seek telehealth. And I think that the important piece here and like the political makeup of living in a state like Missouri is the conversations that circulate in families, that circulate between peer networks, and the uptick of hate crimes, which we see in the Jewish community all the time, right? When there's a little bit of acceptance of anti-Semitism or non-condemnation of an anti-Semitic moment or crime, then it grows and it fuels the community's like allowance of that kind of reaction. So I think that what's the most important thing is to know that families are scared about where their kids can be themselves, and kids are feeling that weight of who they are. So that the political arena has entered into our lives so deeply that we can't escape it very easily. And it's like a general topic of conversation in all types of communities, whether it's a classroom or a sports team or a barbecue, or et cetera. So it will be something that camps also have to be aware of and have an understanding of how to hold space for that, and also how to have a no tolerance policy for any kind of hate towards transgender youth, whether it's gentle microaggressions or it's actual aggression. I think that answered the question, but I'm happy to like be more specific if you want.
Yeah, no, I think it might be interesting to hear from Rose, because I know that Texas has been really making a lot of national headlines in its approach to trans young people. So what of what Shira just said kind of resonated in terms of what you're experiencing in Texas? What might feel different? And is there anything kind of are there regional differences that are worth noting, or is this in a weird way kind of like a kind of broad national experience right now?
I would say it's the latter more than the former, because it's important to note that the same people and PACs are writing these bills and laws. They're all coming from the same sort of politically conservative bloc that is drafting this legislation and sending it out to state houses across the country. So that's why you're seeing gender affirming care bans for youth under 18 proposed in every state. And there is slight variations state to state. A big thing that's making headlines right now in Texas is the drag ban. And we've seen that in Tennessee, we've seen that in Florida. I think those are the only 3 places that have had a drag ban gain traction. But yeah, Texas is going through almost exactly the same thing, where we have a bill on the governor's desk right now that would ban puberty blockers and hormone replacement therapy for youth under the age of 18. And it hurts because it's discriminatory. Like, plain and simple. This is, I think I'm saying this because I think this is a crowd that might not be so familiar with the way that gender affirming care for trans youth works. But it's the same medications that are prescribed for cisgender youth and cisgender adults. Puberty blockers are routinely prescribed for cisgender youth who go through what's called precocious puberty or early puberty. Hormone replacement, or not, it wouldn't be hormone replacement therapy, but hormones like estrogen and testosterone are routinely prescribed for cisgender youth and cisgender adults. So what's happening is that this care is being outlawed only for the treatment of gender dysphoria. Only if you're trans can you not receive these medications. So that's discrimination, plain and simple. And it's saying that you, as a human being, something about you is different or is lesser than that of your peers. And it's not, and in terms of, what Jewish spaces or other affirming spaces, the role that we have to play in this, it's hard, or might be a big ask for like a Jewish camp, say, to take on, getting their youth medication that they need. That's not a role that's to play, but a role that can be to play is to make sure that the trans youth in your spaces, like Shira and that, like Rabbi Micah have been saying, that the trans youth in your spaces feel, equal and accommodated. And that, because this might be one of the few accommodating spaces that they have, depending on, what state you're in and where you live. I think it's also important to note that a lot of other non-affirming legislation, such as don't say gay bills, book bans, things that affect the public education sphere, those can't really touch Jewish organizations that work with youth, at least right now, because they affect the public sphere in places that receive public money, et cetera, et cetera. So we've been getting at SOJOURN, which I don't know if this context was provided. SOJOURN works with Jewish organizations in the South, specifically on LGBTQ issues. At SOJOURN, we've been getting a lot of questions about, well, can I still offer LGBTQ affirming programming at my synagogue, at my youth group? The answer is 100,000% yes. And you should be, because that's maybe going to be the only place that your youth are getting that information and that knowledge and that affirmation.
Yeah, when Erin was speaking at the beginning about how Jewish camps can provide for kids who grow up in places where they might be the only Jewish kid and they don't have community, I thought about how resonant that is with queer kids who grow up sometimes in places where they can feel like the only ones. Another thing that I've been thinking about in the context of the legislative sessions that we've seen is that you do see young queer people speaking to legislators and saying, hello, here's me, here's, I'm a person. and trying to just communicate their humanity to try to fend off this very determined political move. And that's just strikes me as a lot for young people to ask them to just publicly try to argue for their own humanity. And it doesn't seem to work very much, which I think also can be truly disheartening. Rabbi Micah, you were nodding. I don't know if you have any thoughts to share about what we as adults sometimes might try to put on young people in the face of things that are targeting them particularly.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, that nod was about wanting to hold that both these young people have been some of the most powerful leaders and speakers and makers of change, and that it is an utter travesty that children are being called upon to defend their own personhood and humanity, sometimes being received by people who are not there wanting to listen to that. And so I want to hold, not taking away the platform from those young people who have absolutely powerful and important words to share, but that so many of us can and should be in those spaces, first and foremost, to support them, and secondly, to make sure that the job is not theirs to do.
That's a good point. I want to talk a little bit about parents and those of you who talk to or work with parents. I am married to a woman. I have 2 kids, and I get involved with Pride at my kids' school every year. And you know, there's a lot of like 2 mom, 2 dad families, and they're always like, yeah, we'll help with Pride. And then there are the families where the parents are straight, cis people, and they have a queer kid, and they're on such a learning curve, and are coming to queer parents to say, you know, help me understand this. I want to support my kid, but I don't even know where to start. And I know part of this is about sharing resources and ideas, and I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts for parents in that situation who are on that learning curve, about, you know, what support might look like, and where to go to learn more. Who wants to start? Jump ball. Okay, Rabbi Micah, I'll call on you.
There. Actually, what I'm looking at right now is some really fabulous data that comes out of the Trevor Project. They conduct a yearly survey of LGBTQ youth mental health and well-being. And in their latest survey, they asked young people, what does support from your parents and caregivers look like? And the top 5 answers that they received is that when parents and caregivers are welcoming to their partners or out LGBTQ friends, that is one of the key indicators of safety and ways of making concrete support within the home. Speaking respectfully about LGBTQ identity, and I'm going sort of in order from most commonly reported, using their names and pronouns correctly. Right, whatever work one needs to do inside of one's own head and heart and mouth to get that practice, that is often the single highest impact thing that parents, caregivers, and adults in young people's lives can do. Supporting their gender expression. And then finally, when parents and caregivers educated themselves about LGBTQ identities, people, and issues. Right, so some of that might mean saying to somebody, look, I went to this program tonight, there was a panel, I'm trying to learn more. Or, hey, I learned this really cool term. You know, is that something you've heard in your community, in your school, in your camp? Can you tell me a little bit more about it? Right? Or having out the book that you as the parent are maybe reading that helps you educate yourself. Maybe not even saying anything, but that's the book that's sitting out on the shelf, on the table by the couch, because you're the one going and doing that learning. And those are, again, this is from LGBTQ youth themselves reporting what are the concrete actions inside the home that are experienced as supportive. I'm going to pass it to Rose and Shira as well for more.
I just want to say that I think that's so clarifying. It's also so simple. It's so, in some ways, it's kind of like, it's so, it just seems manageable. It's not saying like move a boulder or, you know, like learn a new language. Maybe even a bit. But yeah, I think it's interesting how many of those require a lot of some intention, but not maybe a huge amount of labor. Shira, why don't I toss it to you next?
Yeah, I 100% agree with what was just noted. And I'll say that along that same statistic, when trans and or queer kids have one supportive adult in their life, their mental health risk goes down by 40%. It's like 40% less likely to harm themselves or want to change their course of living because one adult, parent, teacher, any supportive adult in their life sees them and values them. So it's all of the 5 things are exactly right. And in my work, I think there's a huge gap between parents, cisgender parents raising cisgender and straight parents raising trans kids and queer parents raising a trans kid, because we are a very community focused group of people who have had to find our own resilience collectively, no different than being a Jewish community or having a Jewish parent or non-Jewish parents raising a Jewish kid type of situation. And so it really is to lean into resources that I think the community offers for the expanded community. Things like Transparent is an incredible organization that is led by parents for parents to find support for their families. And they also have like an adjacent, like once your kid gets into middle school type of youth group style of meetings for the kids as well. And I think like PFLAG or any of those organizations, Transparent is usually an organization that is often more broad and has like a statewide access. So like there might be one Transparent in the state, and PFLAG has so many chapters in every county and every city, and they're all like community centric and unique. So I think that that's another really great resource to first finding the emotional maturity to understand yourself on your child's journey and to have support in that journey so that you can best care for your kid and not put that emotional weight outward. And Rose?
Y'all touched on so many of the things that I was going to say. I was also going to shout out Transparent. And there's also here in Houston and in Texas, there's somebody wonderful named Mandy Giles, who's part of the Jewish community and runs an organization called Parents of Trans Youth, where she's a real educator on that. We also have an organization called Gender Infinity here in Texas that does conferences and family camps for trans youth and their families, something that might seem familiar to the Jewish community. And yeah, just echoing that it means so much when parents and family members do make an effort to educate themselves. I'm not a trans youth, but I'm a trans young adult. I'm 25, and my parents and grandma sometimes will just like pop in to a Zoom that I'm leading sometimes, and then they'll text me afterwards and say, oh, I learned, this is what I learned. Or even just knowing that they're there and seeing that they're there and want to learn more about who I am, what I do for work and stuff. And they, I answer their questions when they come to me personally too, but just wanted to speak from my own personal experience that even beyond youth, that effort to educate and to learn really, really makes a difference. And also sort of going off of what Shira was saying about having one supportive adult. I know this is a little bit harder for parents to swallow sometimes, but that your kid might need support that doesn't come from you, or that your kid might, this is sort of something that another area that folks are trying to legislate out of existence. There's laws that are being passed about disclosure requirements for if a child comes out to a teacher or somebody at school, they're obligated to report it to the parents. And so that's something that we've been talking about a lot lately at Sojourn, is kind of the Jewish communal view of raising kids, like we're taught that, Torah is passed l'dor vador from generation to generation, not just by the parents, but from the entire community. And that, if someone teaches Torah to your kid, it's as if they've also brought them up, and I think those are important lessons to take when it comes to the queer community as well, that supportive non-parental adults are also important and allowed. And unfortunately, we have some folks in our states who are trying to make it so that that's not allowed, and that the parents are the be-all end-all of support for a kid. And yeah, I think that's important to note as well.
Yeah, especially because I think there's such a tradition in the queer world of having queer elders who can help you understand what life might look like, and what being queer might look like, and how to grow up. And yeah, and I agree that it can be difficult for parents, but oftentimes gay people, queer people, trans people don't come from queer trans parents, so it's not culture that can be passed down in the same way that Judaism can be passed down, maybe from your parents. It is now 7:44, and I know there might be questions from people in the audience, and I don't want to monopolize our panelists' time, so I'll hand it back to Aaron to go through some of those questions.
Thank you. And yeah, we do have a couple questions in the chat, and if any additional questions come through, and if we have time, we'll address those. But our first question is from Evelyn, and Evelyn asks or says, in general, I'm wondering about your experiences of acceptance or not in Jewish spaces, particularly synagogue. And personally, she says she wants to be welcoming without appearing condescending or overly curious or coming across as quote unquote trying too hard. Would love to know your responses to that.
I'm sure everybody has ways to respond to that. I can start off because I saw that question in the chat and I immediately thought about some experiences that I've had. I think it's, at a certain level, it's just basic consideration, making an effort to use somebody's correct pronouns, being conscious of the ways that somebody might move differently through the world than you do. Like, for example, this isn't in a Jewish space, but I'm part of a group that I needed a t-shirt for. And one of the members, the person in the group that was responsible for distributing the t-shirts, I filled out a form with my t-shirt size and stuff. And then somebody messaged me saying, would you like a women's medium t-shirt or a men's medium t-shirt? And for me, as a trans person, the answer was a men's medium t-shirt. And just the fact that somebody was conscious enough of how I identify and how my desires as far as clothing might be different, meant a lot. But also it made me think about how the system for getting people their t-shirts shouldn't be, so gendered in the first place. So there's that basic consideration, and there's also making sure your institution has the policies in place that would make it so that somebody doesn't have to have any sort of quote unquote special consideration at all. So yeah, I don't know if Rabbi Micah, Shira, you have other thoughts.
I'll go. I feel like, yeah, I'll go. I have had like similarly challenging experiences that are both like feel like nuanced and also like much broader. And I think this goes a little bit to Selena, what you were saying about queer ancestors. Like I think Judaism models this perfectly, that we call role models examples. And in like queer vernacular, especially at in spaces with a lot of queer youth, I call them possibility models. And I think that the most important thing that we've hit on is that like the visibility and the presence of adults, whether that adult is like a 16-year-old camp counselor to an 8-year-old or my elder to me, gives me the permission of access into any spaces. And so for me growing up, it was really the first time I saw and I had an open lesbian rabbi on the pulpit at a conservative congregation, where I felt like seen or like accepted, or like that there could be a potential where like I fit. And so I think that the biggest part of having synagogues is welcoming spaces, having leadership that reflects the diversity of who you want in those doors. And leadership, right? I know there's like sometimes just one rabbi, like from any of the staff that works, that greets the president, whomever it is that is a leader in that space, to reflect the diversity of who you want in that space, is like the starting point. And then I would say, like, if we're talking prayer space, for me, I felt very excluded growing up, and both now when I know like Hebrew is very gendered and our prayer space is very gendered, and there are tons of projects that are trying to break down those boxes and be more expansive. And for me, I think very like my personal experience, if I had a B'nai Mitzvah, fun fact, I'm a triplet, so like we all had it together and it wasn't gendered, but that's because it was like a collective of like a gaggle of kids. But if I had that option as a single person to have a B mitzvah or a B'nai Mitzvah, and I think like there's little indications like that in how we do ritual that sets the tone that you belong, more than rainbow flags. Like we don't need them, or some people need them. I don't want to say that. Some people need them, and it's like very, very important. And walking in a pride parade as a synagogue, very important. But I think like how we practice the day-to-day life of the institution, from synagogue to nonprofit Jewish space to camp space, is all it's the possibility for reflecting that you belong here.
I just want to love and second everything that you both said about what are those structural ways that we build communities that have the infrastructure for belonging and welcome. And I want to sort of move in a slightly different direction with this question of sort of how do we, maybe on a person-to-person level, convey welcome and genuineness and curiosity without coming off as condescending or overly curious or trying too hard. I think I frame it in sort of two guideposts, right? One is express curiosity about the full range of who a person is, right? That none of us are ever just the most marginalized or seemingly most different identity that we bring into a room, and having to only represent that can feel really challenging. And the second piece I would say is just be aware of what is the level of intimacy and connection in this relationship, and what are the ways in which I would ask questions based on that relational context, right? There are questions that are great to ask someone that you're meeting for the first time. Tell me how you spend your days. What did you enjoy about what we just heard in this service? Those are awesome questions for the first time we meet someone. And the kinds of questions that maybe sometimes trans and gender expansive people get from folks in a first introduction conversation are more along the lines of, that's something I talk about with my deepest, closest friends, because we have invested deep relationship and trust and reasons why we want to be known in those ways. But tell me how you knew your gender isn't a first introduction question. And that doesn't mean that it comes from an ill-intentioned or bad place. It's about, let's be on the same page of what is the level of intimacy in this conversation.
Thank you. We do have a couple other questions. I'm looking at the clock. Hopefully we got time for these. It's really good questions here. Adina asks, and you can probably see this in the chat too. Adina asks, what's some good phrasing to shut down comments like when someone says, "That's so gay," from kids? Maybe this is at school or at camp. What's a good way to shut that down while also preserving a safe space for LGBTQ youth without reinforcing a misconception that calling someone gay is an insult?
I love the idea of saying, hey, that sounds like an identity word. Identity words aren't insults.
I agree. And I also think, like, depending on if they're young children, saying something like, that saying it that way might hurt one of your friend's feelings. And we don't want to hurt people's feelings if we're just trying to like make a statement. So why don't we not say that?
Thank you. Really thoughtful. One of our camp alums, Amy, asked a question about that I think is really topical for a lot of camps, something that we worked with Keshet on and we're still working with actively. And I know it's something that Camp Indigo Point and Shira's community serves. And so the question is along the lines of, given the fact that traditionally, or in the past, most camps were divided along gendered lines, boys' cabins, girls' cabins. What are the ways, or what are the thoughts that camps can support non-binary campers today and moving forward?
I have so many thoughts on this topic. I've consulted with a number of Jewish summer camps over the years, and I understand how challenging it is to go from a physical structure that is to wanting to make change and trying to figure out what that looks like. And I also recognize that like there is an ideal, and maybe that ideal is not very obtainable. For Camp Indigo Point, we have 3 options for every age group that we room in cabins together. We say that like you will be bunked appropriately with your age. And then it's your choice of what cabin you feel most comfortable in. And we have boys, girls, and all gender. And we like carve out those understandings of a boys' cabin is for anybody who identifies with or aligns with being a boy, or feels or identifies or aligns with being masculine, and the same for being a girl or being in a female cabin. So I want to like iterate that it's not cisgender boys and cisgender girls. It's actually every cabin situation is all gender. And it is your individual preference where your comfort is. We have our youngest kids, 6th through 4th graders, or 2nd through 4th graders are only all gender cabin. And then we move on from there. And it definitely is a facility issue. It's how many cabins do you have, how like it is a sheer number. And so I would say that the default is all gender cabins. If there is only an option for like 1 or 2 categories per age, it is to remove the underlying category. And I think that opens up the possibility for gender fluidity, gender expansiveness, I actually have a lot of campers that are trying it out, what fits. And that's very common in puberty age children. And so they like having the option to be in an all gendered space, even if they align very strongly with a binary gender, it allows them that breath to like change their mind a little bit in their peer group and in their peer spaces. And then counselors match those identities as well. So if you're in an all gender cabin, you might have non-binary counselors, you might have gender expansive counselors, or you might have a counselor that's a cis female counselor that feels very comfortable housing an all gender cabin. But for us, it's about respect and privacy and honoring everybody's identity and having cabin norms or group norms.
I love that. And definitely, I love how, as you alluded to, there can be a process of, if a camp hasn't offered an option like that at the beginning, a process of how one gets to rolling it out, talking with stakeholders, building buy-in to start with, we have enough people for this cabin for this year. And I also want to hold up that there's a really important distinction that you named between making sure that an all gender space exists as a goal to work towards, and assuming that that means we are deciding for an individual non-binary camper which space is safest and most affirming and appropriate for them, and holding that we really want to create spaces where, especially people who might be in a moment of growth and shift and transition, or for whom being non-binary hasn't been historically supported at camp, that there's the opportunity to say, this is what is going to help me feel like I get to show up as myself and feel safe and dignified in my housing situation.
I just want to add on to that a little bit, because I do know it's a journey that that some camps that I've worked with that have like separate villages, like girls village, boys village. It's about changing the name of the village so that you don't gender the space ahead of who lives in that space, or you don't call it a boys cabin. You call it like a red cabin or grass cabin, or like there's like any name that you want to at camp can be the title of a cabin or a village, and it doesn't have to default to the two separate binary gender structure.
And that can seem like such a small thing, right? Oh my goodness, but if we're only housing people who tell us that they're boys in the mountain cabin, is that just slapping another label on it? And actually, it's not. It's, what does it mean every time you're going to address that group of human beings? If you say the word boys, right, for someone who's maybe sitting not right with that, that feels like a moment of ouch every time you say the word. And so it is an important and powerful change to do that, even as there might still be bigger structural changes in process.
I'm not somebody who works in camps really, but I did grow up in a lot of gender segregated Jewish spaces. And I wish that I had had those kinds of options, because when I came out, it sort of felt like there wasn't a place for me in Judaism anymore if I wasn't a Jewish woman and couldn't access those spaces and sort of be in that way in my religion that I had taught to be. So just wanted to support everything y'all have said.
Well, I just want to, looking at the time, I know we're just over an hour. This has been packed with lots of wisdom and insight and thoughtfulness. And on behalf of our community, our campers, our alumni, our federation community, and more, thank you. Thank you so much to all of you for your time and for sharing. Thank you, Selena, for moderating. Thank you, Shira and Rabbi Micah and Rose. And my only regret as I look at the time is that we didn't have time to learn more about each of your organizations, and they're all so tremendous. So I want to note that We will send a follow-up email. We'll include the recording, and we'll also include links to each of your organizations and the resources that were mentioned today. It's just, for so many reasons, it's so important. And so again, thank you. And we're seeing lots of comments coming in the chat along those lines. So it's clear that you've all really, that what you've shared today, I think, is going to be really impactful and help in so many ways. Thank you. I do have a couple other things to mention that, of course, this event it's one of our virtual events. We'll be back in the fall after our summer. We're looking forward to seeing Rabbi Micah and Shira at Camp Ben Frankel later this summer. And Rose, Selena, we'll have to talk. Maybe we can make something work. And again, thank you all for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your evenings, and we'll be in touch with you all soon over your email.